The air in the dimly lit room was thick with tension, the kind that wraps around your throat like an invisible noose. Across the table, Jacob Radnor sat frozen, his face pale, his fingers twitching ever so slightly. He had been a man of confidence, of careful calculation, until now his carefully woven lies were unraveling, thread by thread, under the piercing gaze of Hercule Poirot. "You have played a clever game, monsieur," Poirot said, his voice deceptively calm. "But even the cleverest player must face his final move." Radnor swallowed hard. He knew at that moment that he was caught. "Miss Eleanor Wade," announced the housekeeper before vanishing as swiftly as she had arrived. I had seen many improbable clients seek Poirot's wisdom, but the woman who now hesitated in the doorway, her gloved hands gripping the clasp of her worn leather handbag, struck me as the most unexpected of all. She was unremarkably ordinary, frail, draped in a dark, modest coat with a brooch at her collar, and her dull brown hair pinned back in an unflattering fashion. 100 Eleanor Wades drifted through London streets daily, faceless and forgettable. Poirot, however, stepped forward with his usual charm, sensing her unease. "Mademoiselle, please, do sit. My friend Captain Hastings." The woman sat stiffly, her gaze darting about before she found her voice. You are the detective." "At your service, mademoiselle." She hesitated, her fingers tightening over the handbag. "I wasn't sure. I mean, I shouldn't even be here, but I have nowhere else to turn." Poirot inclined his head. "Proceed, I implore you." She exhaled shakily. "I don't trust the police. Too much noise, too many questions. But something is terribly wrong, and I cannot ignore it any longer." Poirot's sharp gaze never wavered. "Go on. It's my sister, Mr. Poirot. She's dying." Or rather, she swallowed hard, lowering her voice to a whisper. "I fear she is being killed." The silence that followed was suffocating. "Murder Mademoiselle Wade." Poirot's voice was gentle, but the word itself made her shudder. "I don't know, but I do know she was well just weeks ago, and now she is wasting away before my eyes." She pressed a trembling hand to her lips, and I cannot help but wonder, what if she doesn't know the danger she is in? What if I am too late? "Speak freely, mademoiselle. If your suspicions are unfounded, think of the relief you will feel." Eleanor Wade exhaled unsteadily, her hands trembling in her lap. "That's just it. This uncertainty is unbearable. Mr. Poirot, I fear I am being poisoned." A heavy silence followed. Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And what leads you to this dreadful conclusion?" The woman, her earlier hesitation vanishing, launched into a desperate account, her words tumbling over each other. "It's the pain, the unbearable sickness after meals. At first I thought it was nothing, a stomach ailment perhaps, but it never stops. And then there's the doctor. He keeps changing my prescriptions, but his eyes, Mr. Poirot, they betray his doubt." Poirot folded his hands. "And have you voiced these fears to him?" "No. If word got out, I'd never be able to show my face again. Perhaps I am wrong. But then, why do I always feel better when my brother is away?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Even the housekeeper has noticed, and there's something else, a bottle of rat poison. No one admits to using it, yet it's half empty." Her eyes pleaded for reassurance, but Poirot remained still, his mind already in motion. "Let us establish facts. Where do you reside, mademoiselle?" "Aldmere House, just outside Brighton. It's been in my family for generations, and your household consists of my elder brother Charles. We live alone. We have no other family." She hesitated before adding, "That is, we lived alone, until last week." "Ah, and what happened last week?" A shadow flickered across her face. "It was our maid Alice. She'd been with us for years, but suddenly she left without warning, without a word of explanation. She was always devoted to me, Mr. Poirot, but that last week she avoided me. I caught her looking at me with such pity, and then one evening, she packed her things and vanished. Her fingers twisted together. I haven't seen her since. Mr. Radcliffe says it's best to leave her be, let her come to her senses." Poirot's brow lifted slightly. "Mr. Radcliffe." A flicker of hesitation crossed Eleanor Wade's face, her earlier confidence faltering. "Oh, he's just a friend. A kind man. Poirot's gaze sharpened. And this friend of yours, does he share an acquaintance with your brother? No, nothing like that, she said quickly. He's merely been concerned for me. Poirot leaned back, changing his approach. Tell me, mademoiselle, you and your brother, are you comfortably situated? Yes, we're well off. And the money, it is yours, or his? A shadow passed over her face. It's all Charles. I have nothing of my own. Poirot nodded thoughtfully. You understand, mademoiselle. To be thorough, we must be direct. If someone wished you harm, there must be a reason. No man poisons merely to pass the time. Eleanor's lips pressed together, her eyes darkening. There is someone, a woman, a stranger to me, but not to Charles. Her voice took on a bitter edge. He calls her Evelyn. She came into his life suddenly like a storm. Younger than him, golden-haired, with a smile that hides more than it reveals. And since she arrived, he has changed. She swallowed hard. She has a way of looking at me, Mr. Poirot, as if I'm already gone. Poirot was silent for a long moment. Then softly he asked, and the poison, have you any proof? Eleanor exhaled shakily. A bottle.
But
In the study, marked as a tonic, but I found the same bottle in the kitchen last month. Only then, it was labeled rat poison, and now it is gone. Your niece, does she have any money of her own? Poirot's voice was measured, but his gaze was sharp. Eleanor Wade hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. A small allowance, about £50 a year, barely enough to manage on her own. She exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening in her lap. I suppose she'd be glad enough to return to the house if I were no longer there. Poirot's expression remained unreadable. Then you have thought of leaving. Eleanor lifted her chin slightly, defiance flickering behind her nervous demeanor. I won't let him control everything, Mr. Poirot. Women aren't helpless anymore, not like they used to be. Poirot nodded approvingly. I commend your spirit, mademoiselle, but let us be practical. You returned to Aldermere House today. Yes, I came on the early train, before dawn. I have a return ticket for this evening.
Excellent.
I have nothing pressing at the moment. Your concerns intrigue me. I believe I shall visit Aldermere myself. Shall we say that Hastings here is a distant cousin of yours, and I merely an eccentric friend? It is often best to observe without announcing oneself. Eleanor's lips parted, relief flashing across her face. You will come, indeed. In the meantime, mademoiselle, eat only what you prepare with your own hands, or what is prepared in your sight. Do you have a maid you trust, Jessie? She has been with me for years, Mr. Poirot, a good girl. Then let her be the only one who serves your food. Poirot stood, offering her a reassuring nod. Tomorrow, mademoiselle, be brave until then. Eleanor allowed herself a small shaky smile before gathering her things and departing. Poirot remained motionless for a moment, then walked slowly to his chair and sat down, deep in thought. His fingers traced the armrest absently, then his eyes flicked to the floor. Barely visible against the carpet, lay 2-minute strands of feather, a remnant of Eleanor's scarf, wrenched loose in her anxious grip. Poirot picked them up, rolling them between his fingers. His gaze was thoughtful, but in its depths a quiet certainty had begun to take shape. Poirot lifted the 2 delicate strands of feather from the carpet, turning them between his fingers as he examined them with quiet fascination. Without a word, he dropped them into the waste-paper basket and leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. His eyes, sharp as ever, turned to me. What do you make of the case, Hastings? I exhaled slowly, shaking my head. A nasty business, I should say. If Mrs. Wade's suspicions are correct, it's horrific to think about. Poirot gave a small thoughtful nod. Yes, if her fears prove true, it is indeed a sinister affair. But let us consider, mon ami, the alternative. What if they are not? He tapped his fingers against the arm of the chair rhythmically. It is a dangerous time for any husband to purchase a bottle of weed killer, is it not? A wife suffering from gastritis, prone to anxiety, begins to suspect the worst. The world whispers, and suddenly a simple illness becomes something more insidious. You think that's all this is? I asked, frowning. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Ah, but that is the question, is it not? On the surface, this case is entirely ordinary, so much so that it fascinates me all the more. Because Hastings, I do not believe that Mrs. Wade is an overly imaginative woman. No, she is troubled, afraid, but she is not the sort to fabricate wild accusations without reason. That, mon ami, is what makes this so very intriguing. He paused, tapping a precise rhythm on the arm of his chair before continuing. What do you think of her feelings toward her husband? I considered for a moment. Loyalty struggling with fear, I said at last. She wants to believe in his innocence, but something inside her won't let her. Poirot gave a slight smile. An excellent observation, Hastings. And yet typically, a wife will accuse anyone in the world before she accuses her husband. Even when all logic is against her, she will cling to him. And yet, Mrs. Wade came to me. Not the police, not a lawyer, me. Why? Because of the other woman, I suggested. Ah, yes. Jealousy can twist affection into hatred, but hatred, Hastings, does not come to me in quiet desperation. No, hatred desires spectacle, it seeks an audience. If Mrs. Wade truly despised her husband, she would want a scandal, she would want justice. But she hesitates. She came to me, not to accuse him, but to know. And that is why, my friend, I believe we are dealing with something far more complex than a mere marital betrayal. His gaze darkened slightly, his voice dropping to a murmur. There is an unknown element in this affair, Hastings, an invisible thread that we have yet to grasp. Why did she come to me? To have her fears soothed, or to have them confirmed? He drummed his fingers once more, his voice almost to himself now. Is she a superb actress? Ah, Mrs. Wade. No, no, I do not think so. I would swear she was genuine, and that, my dear friend, is precisely why I am interested. Poirot fell into silence, his mind already working, chasing down unseen clues in the depths of his brilliant mind. And I, watching him, felt the first chill of unease creep up my spine. Poirot adjusted his cuffs with meticulous precision as we waited at Paddington Station. His face was unreadable, his little grey cells already at work on the troubling case before us. When the 1:50 to Pengelley was called, we boarded swiftly, and as the train rolled out of the station, I found myself watching Poirot closely, trying to gauge his thoughts. The journey was long and uneventful. The rhythmic hum of the train soon lulled me into a light sleep, and I woke only when Poirot nudged me sharply. "We have arrived, Hastings," he said, his voice quiet but firm. Outside the window, the landscape was darkening under the weight of evening, and a cool, damp breeze greeted us as we stepped onto the nearly deserted platform of the bleak little station. Pengelley was a quiet, forgotten town. The air smelled of damp earth, sea salt, and chimney smoke. A single lamp-post flickered at the end of the platform, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally in the dim light. With our bags in hand, we made our way to the Duchy Hotel, a modest establishment with low wooden beams and the scent of old leather-bound books lingering in the air. After a light meal, Poirot dabbed his lips with his napkin and looked at me keenly. "Come, Hastings," he said. "It is time we pay our respects to your cousin." The Pengelley house stood a little way back from the main road, a quaint cottage with ivy creeping up its walls. The scent of stocks and mignonette drifted through the air, mingling with the soft rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. The scene was almost too peaceful, too picturesque, and a strange unease settled over me as we approached the door. It seemed impossible to associate such a place with dark intentions and whispered fears. Poirot knocked, waited, then rang the bell. Silence. He rang again, the chime echoing hollowly inside. After a long pause, the door creaked open. A disheveled-looking maid stood before us, her apron slightly askew, her eyes red-rimmed, and her face blotchy from tears. She sniffled violently, her breath hitching. Poirot stepped forward gently. "We wish to see Mrs. Pengelley. May we enter?" The maid stared at him, as though he had spoken in a foreign tongue. Her lips trembled, and then with an unexpected bluntness, she whispered, "Haven't you heard then?" Poirot's gaze sharpened. "Heard what, mademoiselle?" She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, and spoke the words that sent a shiver down my spine. "She's dead. Died this evening, about half an hour ago." I felt as though the air had been knocked from my lungs. Dead? The very woman who had come to us in fear, who had pleaded for our help, now, gone. What did she die of? I managed to ask at last, my voice hollow. The maid hesitated. She glanced over her shoulder, as though fearful someone might overhear. Her hands trembled as she wrung them together. There's some as could tell, she murmured darkly. Then lower still, almost to herself, and I reckon they will, one way or another. Poirot's expression remained unreadable, but his entire body tensed. The maid took a shaky breath. If it wasn't that somebody ought to be in the house with the missus, I'd pack my box and leave tonight. But I won't leave her, not with no one to watch by her. A thick silence settled between us. Somewhere in the distance, a dog howled. Poirot inhaled deeply and stepped forward into the dimly lit hallway. His voice was soft but firm. Then, my dear girl, you will not watch alone. The maid's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and foreboding. Poirot remained eerily still, his eyes locked onto the girl's trembling figure. For someone who had insisted it wasn't her place to say anything, she had certainly said a great deal. It's all over the town, she whispered again, as if the walls themselves might be listening. And if Mr. Radnor don't write to the Home Secretary, someone else will. The doctor may say what he likes, but we all know. Her voice caught, her fingers twisting the edge of her apron. Didn't I see the master with my own eyes, lifting down that bottle of weed killer from the shelf this very evening? And didn't he jump when he saw me watching him? And the Mrs. Gruel, her voice dropped to a hoarse whisper. The gruel was already on the table, just waiting to be taken to her. She shuddered. Not another bite passes my lips while I'm in this house, not if I die for it. A silence settled over us, thick and suffocating. Poirot's lips pressed into a thin line, his usually unshakable composure slipping into something dangerously close to anguish. Then, without a word, he turned sharply on his heel and strode out into the night. I hurried after him, barely able to keep up with his uncharacteristically long strides. He cut me off with a sharp motion of his hand. His jaw was set, his fists clenched, his normally immaculate poise was gone, replaced by something fierce, something deeply personal. An imbecile, he muttered. A criminal imbecile, that is what I have been, Hastings. His voice was raw with self-reproach. I have boasted of my little grey cells, and yet I have failed. A woman came to me afraid for her life. She put her trust in me, and now she is dead. The words were bitter, filled with something I had never before heard in his voice. Guilt. I never dreamed anything would happen so soon, he went on, his voice quieter now, almost broken. May the good God forgive me, Hastings, but I never truly believed anything would happen at all. Her story, mon Dieu, it seemed too theatrical, too convenient, but she is gone now, and he swallowed hard. I let it happen. The weight of his words settled over me. I had seen Poirot triumphant, indignant, amused, but never like this, never shaken. A flicker of light in the distance caught his attention, and he snapped out of his daze. His posture straightened, his eyes narrowed with renewed purpose. Come, Hastings, we have wasted enough time. There is still much to learn. We reached High Street in silence. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the faint tang of sea salt drifting in from the coast. The second house on the street stood before us, Dr. Adams' residence. A brass plate gleamed under the gaslight, its lettering slightly worn. J. Adams, Maryland. Poirot knocked briskly. The door was opened by the man himself, a stocky red-faced gentleman with tufts of white hair and a slightly impatient expression. He exuded the air of a man who was not often questioned. Dr. Adams, Poirot inquired politely. Yes, yes, what is it? Come in if you must, but make it quick. I've had a damnable day. We stepped inside, the scent of strong disinfectant and pipe smoke thick in the air. Poirot wasted no time. We have come to speak about Mrs. Pengelley. The transformation was instant. The doctor's ruddy complexion deepened to a dangerous shade of purple, his expression darkening. Mrs. Pengelley is dead, he said stiffly. It was a tragic but natural death. I don't know what business you have stirring up nonsense, but I won't have it. Poirot tilted his head ever so slightly. Natural, you say? A woman who feared for her life, who suspected poison, and you declare it was natural? The doctor's grip tightened on the arm of his chair. I don't have to explain myself to you, sir. Now if you'll excuse me." But Poirot wasn't done. His voice was quiet, deadly in its precision. "Did you see the weed killer, Doctor?" He let the words linger, watching for the flicker of hesitation. "Did you test for it?" A beat of silence. Dr. Adams' hand twitched. His face, already florid, darkened even further. Poirot leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me, Doctor, did you truly believe she died naturally, or did you simply not wish to know?" Damned nonsense, every word of it. Dr. Adams' voice boomed through the dimly lit study, his face mottled with irritation. "Wasn't I in attendance on the case? Gastritis, pure and simple. This town's a breeding ground for gossip, scandal-mongering old hens who sit around, spinning tales out of thin air. They read too many of those wretched newspapers, and nothing will satisfy them until someone in their own town is murdered, poisoned, anything to give them something to cackle about." His hands trembled slightly as he snatched up a tobacco pouch and began stuffing his pipe with jerky movements. "I suppose," he went on bitterly, "one of them saw a bottle of weed killer on a shelf, and that was it. Their imaginations bolted like a wild horse. Mark my words, sir, Edward Pengelley wouldn't poison his grandmother's dog, let alone his own wife. And tell me this, if you're so determined to dig up scandal, why the hell would he even do such a thing? What motive?" Poirot, who had been watching the outburst with a calm, almost amused expression, now spoke. His voice was quiet, deliberate. "There is one thing, Miss Le Doctor, that perhaps you do not know." And then in his usual precise and measured manner, Poirot outlined the main facts of Mrs. Pengelley's visit to him. He did not exaggerate, nor did he embellish. He simply stated the cold, undeniable truth. The reaction was instantaneous. Dr. Adams froze, his fingers tightening around his pipe so forcefully that I half expected it to snap in two. His already ruddy complexion deepened to an alarming shade of crimson, his eyes widening in disbelief. "God bless my soul," he blurted, his voice hoarse. "The poor woman must have been mad. She came to you with such accusations. Why in heaven's name didn't she speak to me? That was the proper course of action." Poirot tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "And have her fears ridiculed? Mon cher doctor, not at all, Doctor." Adams sputtered, though the flicker of unease in his eyes betrayed him. "I hope I've got an open mind. If she had only come to me." He stopped short, fumbling with his words. Poirot merely smiled. It was a small, knowing smile, the kind that sent shivers down one's spine. As we stepped out into the cool night air, Poirot chuckled softly to himself. "He is as obstinate as a pig, that one," he mused, shaking his head. "He has declared it to be gastritis, therefore it must be gastritis. No room for doubt, no room for questions." He paused, glancing back at the house. "And yet Hastings, yes? He is afraid." I frowned. "You think so? May we?" His hands trembled. His voice was too loud, too forceful. "He wishes to convince himself as much as he wishes to convince us. He knows deep down that something is not right." Poirot tapped his fingers against his chin thoughtfully. "Yes, his mind is uneasy, my friend. Très uneasy." We walked in silence for a moment, the cobbled streets echoing under our steps, the scent of damper earth mixed with the salty tang of the distant sea. The town was quiet, but there was something in the air, an electricity, a tension that had not been there before. "What's our next step?" I asked finally. Poirot sighed, his momentary amusement fading. "For now, a return to the inn, and mon Dieu, a night of suffering upon one of your terrible English provincial beds. It is a thing to make pity. Hastings, the cheap English bed." I rolled my eyes. "And tomorrow?" Poirot came to a halt beneath a flickering street lamp, his face half in shadow. His eyes gleamed with something sharp, something dangerous. "Rien à faire, we must return to London, and await developments." I stared at him. "That's it? That's all? But what if there are no developments?" Poirot's gaze never wavered, his voice was steady, unwavering. "Oh, there will be, my friend. Mark my words. Our dear Dr. Adams may sign as many death certificates as he pleases, but the truth always finds a way to surface, and when it does, his lips curled into a knowing smile. We shall be ready. He cannot silence several hundred tongues, no matter how hard he tries, and believe me, Monsieur Poirot, they will wag to some purpose. Poirot and I exchanged glances. There was truth in those words. The small town of Pengelley might have been sleepy, but there was nothing drowsy about the sharp tongues that thrived on scandal. Our train for London was scheduled to depart at 11 the following morning. Yet before leaving, Poirot expressed a desire to visit Miss Fredada Stanton, the niece Mrs. Pengelley had spoken of before her tragic demise. It did not take long to find the modest lodging-house where she resided. When we knocked, the door was answered by Miss Stanton herself, a striking young woman, with the classic beauty of old Cornwall, dark hair, deep-set eyes, and cheeks that carried a healthy rosy glow. But there was more to her than beauty. There was fire. Something in the way her eyes flashed suggested a temper not easily curbed. She was not alone. Standing beside her was a tall, dark-haired young man, whose sharp features and confident bearing instantly set him apart from the quiet provincial surroundings. Mr. Jacob Radnor, Fredada introduced him with a slight hesitation. If I had not been looking closely, I might have missed the flicker of unease that passed across her face. Radnor gave a curt nod, his dark eyes assessing Poirot with a certain guardedness. Poirot, ever the gentleman, introduced himself and delicately explained our reason for calling. Poirot, auntie, Fredada murmured, lowering her gaze. It's terribly sad. I've been wishing all morning that I had been kinder, more patient. You endured more than your fair share, Fredada, Radnor interjected firmly, his voice carrying a protective edge. She exhaled softly. Yes, Jacob, but I've got a sharp tongue. I know that much. After all, it was only silliness on Auntie's part. I should have laughed it off instead of letting it irritate me. Poirot tilted his head. You refer to her suspicions about being poisoned. Fredada waved a hand dismissively. Of course it was nonsense. She only felt ill after meals because she was convinced she would. A trick of the mind, you see. She made up her mind to be poisoned, and so she was. Mademoiselle. Poirot leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze resting upon her. What exactly was the cause of your quarrel? A shadow passed over Fredada's face. She hesitated, glancing sideways at Radnor. He picked up on the unspoken cue immediately. I should be going, he announced lightly. See you this evening, Fredada. Goodbye, gentlemen. Heading to the station, I presume. Poirot confirmed that we were. With a nod, Radnor strode off, disappearing down the quiet street. Only when his figure had fully vanished, did Fredada exhale and turn back to us. Poirot smiled knowingly. You are engaged to him, are you not? A faint blush crept up her cheeks. Yes, she admitted. Jacob and I are to be married. Poirot steepled his fingers. And this, I suspect, was at the heart of your quarrel with your late aunt. Fredada bit her lip. Well, yes, but it wasn't just that she disapproved. She paused as if debating whether to continue. Mademoiselle, Poirot's voice was gentle. The truth, if you please. It is important. She sighed. It seems a horrid thing to say, now that she's gone, but you'll never understand unless I tell you. She hesitated once more, then took a deep breath. Auntie was infatuated with Jacob. I blinked. Infatuated? Yes. It was absurd, really. She was over 50 and Jacob, well, he's not even 30. But there it was. She was utterly besotted with him. She hung on his every word, sought his attention at every opportunity. At first I found it amusing, but then it became something else. She looked away, pressing her lips together. Poirot's eyes never left her face. And when she discovered that he was in love with you, not with her, he prompted. Freda swallowed. She was furious. She wept. She accused me of betraying her. She stopped abruptly, as if she had said too much. She even what, mademoiselle? Poirot's voice was velvet soft. Freda shuddered. She told me I'd regret it, that I had no idea what I was doing, that Jacob wasn't who I thought he was. She said she'd rather be dead than see me marry him. A chill settled in the air. Poirot's expression did not change, but I knew that behind his composed exterior, his mind was spinning. And what did Mr. Radnor say of all this? Freda hesitated. Jacob told me to ignore her, that she was being melodramatic, that she would get over it in time. But I don't know. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I don't know if she ever really meant to. Poirot straightened, brushing an invisible speck from his sleeve. His eyes gleamed with something sharp, something dangerous. Mademoiselle, he said softly, I have no more questions for now, but I must urge you think very carefully about whom you trust. The dead, after all, have no voice. But the living, he let the words hang in the air. Freda's hands twisted in her lap, her lips parted as if she wanted to ask something, but she didn't. Poirot nodded politely. We shall take our leave now. Come, Hastings. As we stepped back onto the street, I released a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The morning mist clung to the rooftops, the sea breeze carrying whispers of something unsaid, something unresolved. I turned to Poirot. Well, what do you make of it? He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. I make of it, my friend, he said, that this is not over, not yet, and in my gut I knew he was right. Freda's voice trembled slightly as she continued, though she did her best to hide it behind a forced steadiness. She wouldn't believe a word of it, not one single word, and the things she said to me. She paused, her lips pressing into a tight line. It's no wonder I lost my temper. She was so rude, so insulting. I suppose I should have just let her rant, but I couldn't, not when she was being so unreasonable. Poirot inclined his head slightly, his expression unreadable. And so what did you do, mademoiselle? Freda exhaled, shaking her head. I talked it over with Jacob. He said the best thing to do was for me to leave for a while, let Auntie cool down, let things settle. So I did. I packed my bags and moved out. Her voice softened. Poor Auntie. I suppose she was in a strange state altogether. Poirot's sharp eyes flickered with interest. It would certainly seem so, mademoiselle. Thank you for making things clear to me. As we stepped out onto the narrow cobbled street, the cool morning air brushing against us, I was surprised to see Jacob Radnor waiting a few paces away. He stood with an easy confidence, hands in his pockets, eyes watchful. As we approached, he gave a knowing nod. I can guess pretty well what Freda has been telling you, he remarked casually, but there was something calculated about his tone, something just a little too composed. Poirot said nothing, merely lifting an eyebrow in polite invitation for him to continue. Radnor sighed, shifting his weight. It was a damn unfortunate situation, you understand. Awkward for me too, as you can imagine, but I need hardly say that none of it was my doing. At first I thought the old woman was just being friendly, perhaps even trying to help things along between me and Freda, but then, he gave a short humorless chuckle. Well, it became clear soon enough that her interest in me was something else entirely. You found it unpleasant? Poirot asked mildly. Radnor let out a breath. Wouldn't you? It was absurd, that's what it was. But absurd or not, it made life difficult. He hesitated briefly, then continued. I won't pretend I wasn't relieved when Freda decided to move out. Gave us both a bit of breathing space. Poirot studied him for a long moment. And when do you and Miss Stanton plan to marry? Radnor's gaze flickered slightly, and his jaw tightened just a fraction. Soon, I hope. Now listen, Miss Poirot. I'll be straight with you. Freda thinks her uncle is innocent. Me? He let out a slow breath, lowering his voice. I'm not so sure. I stiffened slightly at his words, but Poirot remained impassive. Radnor glanced around the quiet street, as if ensuring we were alone, then leaned in slightly. Look, I know more than Freda does. I know things that could. He broke off, shaking his head. Never mind. What I'm saying is I'm keeping my mouth shut. Let sleeping dogs lie. What good would it do dredging all this up again? The poor woman is dead, and no scandal's gonna bring her back. Poirot's expression remained neutral, but I could feel the tension radiating from him. And if there has been a crime? He asked softly. Radnor's jaw tightened. Then I don't want to be the one who exposes it. Do you understand? I've got my life ahead of me. My business is growing. I've worked damn hard for it. The last thing I need is to be tangled up in a murder trial. You're a clever man, Poirot. If you dig deep enough, maybe you'll find something. But I put it to you, what good would it do? Mrs. Pengelley hated scandal. She'd turn in her grave if she knew people were whispering her name in connection with murder. You may be right about that, Poirot murmured. You are asking me then to hush it up. Radnor held his gaze. That's exactly what I'm asking. He gave a lopsided smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. I'll admit it. I'm being selfish. I've got my own future to think about, and Freda's, and whatever else you might believe. I do love her. I don't want her dragged into this mess. Let it die with the old woman. Poirot, it's better that way. Poirot regarded him for a long moment. Then very slowly, he smiled, but there was something enigmatic in that smile, something just beneath the surface. Most of us are selfish, Mr. Radnor, he said, but that does not mean the truth stays buried. Radnor said nothing. He merely dipped his head, turned and walked away. As his figure disappeared down the street, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Well, Poirot, what do you think? Poirot was silent for a moment, watching the retreating figure with thoughtful eyes. Then very quietly, he murmured, I think, my friend, that the dead are not always as silent as we believe. A chill ran down my spine. The case was far from over. Radnor's lips curved into a thin smile, though there was no warmth behind it. Not all of us admit it so freely, Miss Poirot, but we all have our own interests to protect, don't we? Poirot's expression remained unreadable. Indeed, that is often the case, and yet some truths are difficult to silence, no matter how hard one tries. He paused, his sharp gaze locking onto Radnor's. I will do as you ask, monsieur, but I must tell you frankly, you will not succeed in hushing it up. Radnor stiffened slightly, his composure faltering for the first time. Why not? Poirot raised a single finger. Because of that. We had just turned a corner, arriving at the town's bustling marketplace. It was market day, and the air was thick with the sounds of life, vendors calling out their wares, the murmur of eager customers, the occasional burst of laughter. Beneath it all ran a different kind of hum, the restless whisper of gossip, of stories passed from one eager mouth to another. Poirot gestured towards the throng. The voice of the people, Mr. Radnor. A secret may be buried, but rumors are like weeds. They grow in every crack. Radnor exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. He said nothing more. Poirot glanced at his pocket watch. Ah, we must hurry, mon ami, or we shall miss our train. With that we left him standing in the busy street, his expression unreadable, as we made for the station. As the train pulled out of Polgowith, I found Poirot engaged in a most particular ritual. With an air of great precision, he had retrieved a small comb and a tiny mirror from his pocket, and was meticulously adjusting his mustache, ensuring his perfectly waxed hair sat exactly in place. I watched him for a moment, then sighed. You seem rather amused, Poirot. He did not look up, his reflection still occupying his full attention. Very interesting, is it not, Hastings? You seem to think so, I replied, stretching back into my seat. To me it all feels rather sordid. There's hardly any mystery about it, just an unfortunate tangle of foolishness and human weakness. Poirot smiled slightly, tucking his mirror away. Ah, but I disagree, mon ami. There is no mystery, none whatsoever. I frowned, turning his words over in my head. Then you believe the girl's story, that her aunt, this respectable middle-aged woman, was infatuated with Jacob Radnor. That's the only part that seemed strange to me. Poirot gave a small, knowing chuckle. You are too much the romantic, Hastings. You believe love has rules, that it behaves predictably, but I tell you it does not. Human nature is rarely so simple. You call it strange that a woman of her age should fix her affections on a younger man. I call it completely ordinary. If you read the papers carefully, mon cher, you will see it happens all the time. A respectable wife of 20 years, a mother of children, suddenly leaving everything behind for a man half her age. Passion, jealousy, obsession, these things do not fade with the years, they merely take on different disguises. I shivered slightly, and if that was the case here, Poirot's expression darkened slightly. If that was the case, then we must ask ourselves a different question. If love drove her to folly, what then drove her to her death? A silence settled between us. Outside the window the countryside rushed past in a blur, peaceful and untouched, and yet in the town we had just left behind, a storm was brewing, one that would not be easily quieted. Poirot tapped a finger lightly against the armrest. "No, Hastings. This is far from over," and for the first time I found myself believing him. "You admire women, Hastings. You throw yourself at their feet, if they so much as glance your way with kindness, but in truth you understand nothing about them." Poirot's words, spoken with quiet amusement, made me shift uncomfortably in my seat. He was twirling the ends of his mustache, his eyes gleaming with something between mischief and deep contemplation. "In the autumn of a woman's life," he continued, "there always comes one mad moment, a fleeting desire for romance, for adventure, before it is too late. Even the most respectable of women, the wives of dentists in sleepy towns, are not immune to it." I frowned. "And you think that's what happened here?" Poirot shrugged. "A clever man might recognize such a moment, Hastings, and a clever man might use it to his advantage." I snorted. "I wouldn't call Pengelley clever. The whole town is buzzing about this mess, and yet I suppose you have a point. The only two men who know anything, Radnor and the doctor, both want to keep it quiet. He must have managed that somehow. I only wish we'd seen the man for ourselves." Poirot gave a small knowing smile. "You may indulge your wish. Return by the next train, and present yourself as a man suffering from a most painful molar. Voila. You will have your audience with him." I studied him closely. "I wish I knew what exactly you find so interesting about this case." Poirot tapped his temple lightly. "Your own words, mon ami. When we spoke to the maid, you yourself remarked that for someone who intended to say nothing, she had in fact said a great deal." I opened my mouth, then hesitated. All I said finally, though I was not entirely convinced, my thoughts circled back to my original criticism. "But why didn't you attempt to see Pengelley yourself?" Poirot's eyes darkened, his voice dropping into something colder, more certain. "Because, Hastings, in 3 months' time, I will see him for as long as I please, standing in the dock." The confidence in his tone sent a shiver through me. For once I hoped Poirot was wrong, but I doubted he was. Time passed and the Cornish affair faded from my mind. Poirot and I were occupied with other matters, and the tragedy of Mrs. Pengelley became just another unsolved mystery among many. But then one morning, a small paragraph in the newspaper brought it all rushing back. An order for exhumation had been granted by the Home Secretary. The implications sent a shiver down my spine. Had Poirot been right all along? Within days the story was everywhere. It seemed the quiet town had never truly put the tragedy to rest, and when Mr. Pengelley announced his engagement to Miss Marks, his secretary, of all people, gossip exploded like wildfire. The whispers turned into accusations, a petition was sent to the authorities, and soon the grave of Mrs. Pengelley was disturbed once more. The results were damning. Large quantities of arsenic were found in her remains. Mr. Pengelley was arrested for the murder of his wife. Poirot and I attended the preliminary hearings. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation and grim satisfaction. The evidence against Pengelley was considerable. Dr. Adams, the family physician, admitted that Mrs. Pengelley's symptoms could have easily been mistaken for gastritis, an oversight that had almost allowed a killer to go free. The Home Office expert confirmed the presence of arsenic, his words cool and methodical, but their weight undeniable. Then came the maid, Jessie. She spilled forth a flood of details, some relevant, many not, but the overall impression was devastating. She spoke of Mrs. Pengelley's growing suspicions, her worsening condition after meals prepared by her husband, the lingering scent of something bitter in her food. The jury watched her closely, absorbing each word. Freda Stanton, the dead woman's niece, took the stand next. Her voice wavered as she recounted how her aunt had always fallen ill after consuming food from her husband's hands. There was something tragic in her eyes, regret perhaps, or the weight of knowing that her dismissals of her aunt's fears had cost the woman her life. Then came Jacob Radnor. His testimony sealed the coffin. On the day of Mrs. Pengelley's death, he had visited unexpectedly. He had found Pengelley in the pantry, hurriedly replacing a bottle of weed killer on the shelf. On the table beside him, still steaming, was a bowl of gruel. the very last meal Mrs. Pengelley ever ate. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. I glanced at Poirot, but his expression remained unreadable. He had known long before anyone else that justice would come, and now it had. Miss Marks, the fair-haired secretary, was next to take the stand. Her composure shattered the moment she was questioned. Tears spilled freely as she collapsed into hysterics, her sobs echoing in the tense courtroom. Between broken gasps, she admitted to what many had already suspected. There had been passages between her and Pengelley. A secret affair, whispered promises, a future together, if only fate, or something more sinister, removed the obstacle that was Mrs. Pengelley. With the evidence mounting against him, Pengelley reserved his defense. The gavel struck, and the accused was sent for trial. As we left the courthouse, Jacob Radnor walked alongside us. His face was pale, the weight of the proceedings heavy upon him. Poirot, ever composed, glanced at him thoughtfully. "You see, Mr. Radnor," he said with quiet certainty, "the voice of the people cannot be silenced. There was to be no hushing up of this case." Radnor let out a long sigh, his gaze fixed on the cobbled street ahead. "Do you see any chance of him getting off?" Poirot shrugged, a small smile tugging at his lips. "He has reserved his defense. Perhaps he has something up the sleeves, as you English say." He paused. "Would you care to join us for a drink?" Radnor hesitated for only a moment before nodding. At our lodgings, I ordered 2 whiskies and sodas. Poirot, ever the eccentric, requested a cup of hot chocolate, a choice that bewildered the waiter. As we waited, Poirot leaned forward, his voice dropping to a murmur. "Of course I have seen many cases like this," he mused, "and yet there remains only one possible escape for our unfortunate Mr. Pengelley." Radnor's brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" Poirot reached into his pocket with the swiftness of a conjurer, and produced a sheet of paper covered in neat, precise handwriting. He placed it gently on the table. "You must sign this confession, Monsieur Radnor," he said calmly. A sharp silence filled the room. Radnor stared at the paper, then back at Poirot. His lips twitched before he let out a short, hollow laugh. "You must be mad." Poirot merely shook his head. "Non, mon ami, not mad, just observant." He leaned forward, his sharp gaze locked onto Radnor's. "You came to this town with nothing, a small business, struggling finances, and yet you saw an opportunity. Mr. Pengelley was a man of means, but his wife, she was the true obstacle. You met his niece Freda Stanton. She was young, impressionable, and she smiled upon you." Radnor's hands clenched at his sides. "But a mere allowance from Pengelley would not satisfy you, would it?" Poirot continued. "No, you needed more. You needed the entire inheritance, and for that both husband and wife had to be removed from the picture." Radnor's breath grew unsteady, but he said nothing. "You were cunning," Poirot admitted. "You played upon Mrs. Pengelley's insecurities, whispering doubt into her ear. You turned her against her husband, made her believe he was unfaithful, made her suspect that he was trying to poison her, and once she was convinced, then your work was easy. You were often at the house, free to tamper with her food, to ensure that the arsenic was introduced at just the right times, when her husband was present." Poirot tapped the table lightly. "You see, you never poisoned her when he was away. No, that would not do. You needed her to believe it was him." Radnor's jaw tightened. "But you made a mistake." Poirot's voice was soft, almost pitying. "You assumed that Mrs. Pengelley would tell no one of her fears except you, but she spoke to others, her niece, perhaps even a friend or two, and most damning of all," he tilted his head, "she made a choice without informing you. She decided to seek help." Poirot leaned back, folding his arms. "And that, my friend, is where your carefully woven plan unraveled." A heavy silence stretched between us. The waiter returned, placing our drinks on the table. The whiskey and sodas remained untouched. The hot chocolate sat steaming in front of Poirot, as he calmly lifted the cup and took a slow, deliberate sip. Jacob Radnor, pale as death, did not move. She had hesitated. She had wavered. If she could be truly certain, beyond any flicker of doubt, that her husband meant to kill her, she would have left him. She would have run to you, to the man who had whispered sympathy in her ear, who had sown the seeds of distrust in her heart. She would have clung to you, desperate for protection, for love. It was what she thought you wanted, but that was never your plan, was it, Monsieur Radnor? You never wanted a middle-aged, frightened woman, weighing down your future. You wanted her gone, you wanted the money, and so you waited for your moment. The opportunity came as it always does for those who lurk in the shadows, waiting for the right second to strike. You were in the house when Pengelley, dutiful husband that he was, prepared his wife's gruel, a pinch, just a pinch of the fatal powder, swift and unseen, and the deed was done. The rest was easy. You, ever so concerned, ever so loyal, subtly encouraged the whispers in town, the rumors that grew and twisted like ivy. You ensured that suspicion clung to Pengelley like a second skin. You stirred the pot, and watched from the sidelines, confident that the blame would never turn toward you. But you reckoned without Hercule Poirot. Radnor's face had lost all color, yet he still held his composure, gripping the arms of his chair as if it were the only thing keeping him grounded. "This is quite the tale, Poirot," he said with a forced smile. "A remarkable story. But why tell me all this?" Poirot leaned forward, his sharp gaze unyielding. "Because, monsieur, I do not represent the law, I represent Mrs. Pengelley." He lifted a folded paper from the table, and spread it flat, his fingers tapping it lightly. "For her sake, I offer you a choice. Sign this confession, and you shall have 24 hours before I turn it over to the police." Radnor did not move, his jaw tensed. "You have nothing on me, no proof." "You think so?" Poirot's voice was quiet, but his eyes gleamed with certainty. "Look out of the window, monsieur." Slowly, cautiously, Radnor crossed the room, his fingers trembling as he pulled the curtain aside. What he saw made him recoil with a sharp curse. "Two men," Poirot said conversationally, "placed there for one reason only." You steepled his fingers. "You see, monsieur, I suggest you sign. It is your best option." Radnor turned back, sweat beading on his brow. "And what assurance do I have that I will keep my word?" Poirot smiled faintly. "The word of Hercule Poirot, that will have to suffice." A silence stretched between them, a long heavy silence. Then with a muttered curse, Radnor grabbed the pen and scrawled his name. "Good," Poirot said softly. "Hastings, would you be so kind as to pull the left-hand blind halfway up?" I did as I was told, though I could hardly believe it. That was the signal, Poirot had said. Radnor was free to go, free to disappear into the night. White with rage, he turned on his heel, and stormed from the room, slamming the door behind him. I spun on Poirot, my blood boiling. "You've let him go," I exclaimed. "You always speak against sentiment, yet you let a murderer walk free out of sheer—" Poirot merely raised a finger. "Non mon ami, that was not sentiment, that was strategy." I stared at him. "Strategy? You handed him his freedom." Poirot chuckled. "Did I?" He leaned back in his chair, utterly composed. "You see, Hastings, we had no true proof against him. Could I stand before 12 stolid men and say, 'I Hercule Poirot, no'? They would laugh at me. No, no. Oh. The only way to trap him was fear, and fear, my friend, is a most effective tool." I felt my anger cool, just a fraction, and those men outside. "Oh." Poirot smiled. "Loafers, my friend, nothing more. I merely observed them earlier, and decided they would serve my—" "Oh." A stunned silence settled over the room. "Now," Poirot said, adjusting his cuff, "Oh. We must keep our word. 24 hours. That is what I promised." His expression darkened slightly. "Pengelley will have a little more time as a freedom man, though he deserves very little pity, for he was a deceiver, and I do not tolerate those who mock the sanctity of family. But Radnor," he shook his head, "he will not escape. I have great faith in Scotland Yard." Ooh. He took a sip of his chocolate, his eyes gleaming. "They will get him, mon ami. They will get him."